Let's try to turn this into a lively last session before Chris scores the final doelpunt, the final goal, the final hit. I think you're, at least as far as I'm concerned, there's a sort of a limitation to intellectual carrying capacity. So, and especially with this weather, it's really a challenging a moment for all of us. First of all, there's another issue on the agenda, which is an inauguration of this beautiful material here behind me. Maybe Tanea, can you just briefly just define or describe what you've been doing there, or what the students have been doing, and then later we combine it with a drink and allow people to have a look. Please, just in 2 minutes, what is happening there? What's lying there?
So that was the very hard work of the group in front of me here. Some missing. In 1 month's time, actually, a group of 4 students and Francesca Rizzetto that unfortunately cannot be here today. With me, we tried to go through the material that we could find about the 9 deltas as an open source data. So what you see, it's a collection, it's a very, let's say, synthetic collection of the most defining layers of those 9 deltas, which is infrastructure, water, the occupation, so built-up form and crops. So the idea of the exhibition was to start with showing in comparison these 4 different layers, and then of course when we put them in, let's say, in close relationship, we start seeing the differences in actually how does each specific delta is formed. And the second part, so that's what you see in the, let's say, in the collection of the small maps in black. And then actually what you're confronted with, the big map in blue, it's the flood risk, 10 meters of 10 meters sea level rise. So it's quite striking to see the alteration of the deltas if we're actually going to project the sea level rise. And the small objects which were 3D printed, they are, again, a selection of the most perhaps defining objects that transformed those deltas throughout the year. So the maps, they show the aspects of formation, and the small objects, they show, let's say, the type of infrastructure, the, let's say, specific forms of living, the boats, the houses, specific structures which are quite characteristic of each one of those 9 deltas. So the idea is to start with this idea of how can we show the aspects of formation and transformation of those deltas in a very synthetic way, in a comparative way, and by putting them together, then the next point is can you actually identify specific objects from one delta that are also present in another delta? So then how translations happen. So you have perhaps the same infrastructural object, but in a different reality that might have assumed a different meaning. So that's the idea in short. So just to give a background to the discussion that we have.
Very good. Thanks a lot. You can give him the microphone. I just had a first glimpse, and it's exquisite material. It's really refined and partially objective, partially intuitive, interpreted scenes, deltaic scenes throughout the world. It's beautiful material. So, and don't put your beer on top of that material. Just promise me that you, you know, if we combine it with a drink, you can get some sort of stains upon the material. So be generous, be careful. Okay, so what this closing session will not provide is a series of comments of all the participants. What I decided to do is to sort of phrase my observations in 4 questions. And those 4 questions we can sort of discuss, and I will present them, and you're able to sort of respond to them, maybe answer them or reject them as well as not relevant or invalid. So we will turn this into a sort of a discussion. That's basically what I've in mind. So let's do a kickoff. I have maybe half an hour, 3/4 of an hour in total. So let's see how far we can get. Actually, this role is, I think, officially the rapporteur. I'm the rapporteur of the workshops, yes. So here I will start with that. So what you have been participating in is 5 different workshops that had a sort of beautiful layout and a beautiful structure. In which, let's say, different cross-national experiences and opinions and expectations were exchanged. The first one was on the North Sea and the Southwest Delta in the Netherlands. The second one had deltas in Kenya and Argentina. The third one, deltas in China and Vietnam. The fourth one was dealing with Nigeria and Bangladesh. And the fifth, an Italian example, and the United States of America. So that might at least be, at least I think it's relevant to having sort of introduced those cases. The first question that popped up in my head was the notion of comparability. And also transferability of findings, of ways of doing. So what is, the question is, working towards a concrete prospect of action in those different deltas? Do we feel more comfortable with the amplification of similarities? Or do we feel more comfortable with the amplifications of differences between those deltas? So what is the level of comparability, transferability of insight and experience in those different deltas? Is there anybody who would like to comment on that? To what extent are we actually discussing incomparable cases or comparable cases? Yeah, that's a tricky one, eh? Yeah.
Yes, there in our case, which was whoa.
No, but it's also is it recorded?
All right.
Is it recorded or not really? It is. Okay, please.
In our case, which was the Po Delta and the Texas, the Houston-Galveston Bay Delta, I think it is totally incomparable that we agreed on. However, comparable is that they both need transformative thinking.
Right.
So that is, I think, that's one of the aspects that is really that was very comparable.
Is that a generic? Then is that maybe adequate for all deltas?
Well, interesting was that the experts in our group after that explained about Rotterdam, and they had also a sort of transformative, though on the other hand, actually also getting back to our traditional Dutch way of making bathtubs. Mm-hmm. So, I don't think it's everywhere the same, no.
Right. Any other experiences or opinions about this? Stefan, yeah?
Yeah, I think from a geographic or landscape point of view, all these deltas or estuaries are a little bit different. And I think it would be worthwhile to make a kind of typology of them because they have, let's say, different origins. Some are more river-dominated, others are more wave-dominated, you can say, and they have an effect on the geomorphology and the growth of the delta itself.
Right.
So that's, I think, where the differences come in. And of course, also from a socio-political point of view, very big differences.
Absolutely.
But I think when you look to this type of landscape, there are many, let's say, similarities in the type of challenges. When you look, for instance, to water problems, it's not only about storm surges or sea level rise, it's also about increasing rainwater or rainstorms, for instance, or subsidence connected to groundwater extraction, salinization. And also from an ecological point of view, often these ecological or these deltas have similar ecosystems, you can say, which suffer from similar problems. So in that regard, there is a commonality in that, but there's also, of course, a big differentiation. And So it is actually both, I think.
Right. So you would we would say there's a sort of there's genericity and there's specificness as well at the same time. Pete.
Yeah, perfect conclusion. I would like to build on that from our two deltas, Bangladesh and Nigeria, Niger Delta. I think everybody can imagine two deltas with immense big problems to deal with, hardly to compare. At the same time, also some comparable issues. The one specific topic that we discussed, I have to admit I brought that topic in myself, is that we don't only need to look at how we can compare these deltas or bring in our knowledge or transfer our knowledge or experience. We should realize that we already have had a lot of influence on these deltas in the past, and not always only in a positive way.
And when you say we, you mean
the Western
Europe?
world.
Yeah.
And to mention the bad word, for instance, Nigeria, our Nigerian colleague, explicitly explained that there's no delta planning for him if he cannot solve the issue around the immense pollution of oil and gas industry, which is impossible to solve because of the political situation and because of the power. Right. And that is, whether we like it or not, as a result of racial issues and of colonialism or neo-colonialism that is still very dominant in that delta. Right. And it's a very tough issue to tackle. We discussed the same with Bangladesh. Strangely enough, not many people realize that Bangladesh has got away from those strangles and developed in only 50 years' time. It's a very young democracy into a country that has a lot of development going on. The word that we came up, that we said, what is really the issue that connects it, it is equity. There is no climate resilience, there is no progress or prosperity in our deltas if we are not able to understand that it is all about equity and that we need to learn to find ways how we can recognize that tough issue that can be very complicated. And how can we that integrate in our design thinking and in our design process? I think that's like a new challenge for landscapers and architects and designers.
Right.
Leave it in.
Thanks. Who of you would feel more comfortable with a sort of physical determinism, and who of you would be more comfortable with a social, cultural, political determinism in trying to define the future of deltas? Or are you all straight in the middle? Do you know what I mean? It's where's the balance?
I think there is social issues that there, but physical things, which is challenges coming, that is climate change or these kind of things, are similar, and the risks also increasing in all the deltas. So these kind of challenges will be similar, and we can discuss this to exchange knowledge and these kind of things. So that will be better for this to solve these technical things, but the social issues are different in different deltas, totally different.
Right. Thank you for this contribution. Erik-Jan, over there.
Well, you know me, I'm more like a physical kind of person, I would say, but nevertheless in our workshop, I did have a couple of eye-openers when it came more to the social-cultural aspect of the deltas. For instance, how the delta is actually managed. You know, I didn't actually know that the differences are so big. To come back to your differences, and.
So it's
that being said, you cannot separate one from the other. You have to actually work within your social-cultural framework, basically, and find the solution for the future within that. Right. As Adriaan Geuze made also his proposition for the Netherlands this morning, coming from basically our culture, you might say.
It's true, yeah.
His definition, though, of our culture, but that's something up
to
for
be debated.
That's something to be debated.
Right.
But the differences or the range of varieties of the cultural aspect, I found that striking. Yeah.
True. Thanks, Stefan.
Yeah, maybe to build on that. So we talked about polder making in this morning. That the Dutch are great that they almost invented it. But what I found out in China, that the Chinese were way earlier with that. So that polder making is not necessarily connected to the Dutch. So in similar circumstances, like deltaic lowlands, there were this particular ways of dealing with the circumstance, and the principles are exactly the same, but the expression, the appearance of the landscape is really different. So in that regard, I think these two worlds are inseparable. So the physical context can be more or less the same, but the way on how people dealt with it and give expression to their landscape is very different.
What would that mean? Just to inform you, Stefan has been involved in the setting up of a so-called global polder atlas. So probably this means that this will be a never-ending story. Probably this to compile all these different polders and describe them.
Shall I say something?
Yes, please. Just briefly.
So what we did is, or we are actually in the finalization of the book. So end of the year.
Good. Okay.
Yeah. So that's a promise.
That's a promise. I'll keep you on it. Yeah.
So, but what we do is indeed from a physical point of view, build up a kind of typology. And then within this typology, we selected a couple of cases, which are more like windows into the cultural differences and the way on how people dealt with it.
So it's sort of the starting point is physical, morphological, historical, and then with some cultural, social comments. Okay, thank you very much. Second issue, if I may. I entitled it Proportionality. Just a brief introduction. It's clear that the levels of administrative capacities of the public sector and the investment potential of the private sector differ strongly from country to country and from delta to delta. So how was the issue of balancing literally historic challenge of vast proportions with the limited resources in terms of legal resources, physical resources, financial resources? How did that issue, was it discussed? It's also on let's say, the similarities and differences between the different cases. Was this an issue? The balancing the availability of resources on one hand and the dimensions of the brief, the dimensions of the challenge at a specific point. And was there any differentiation in approaches to that, in that sense, in trying to find this balance between limited resources and a delta waiting for improvement? Has that been discussed or not really? Or maybe if you digest now what you've been talking about and what you've seen this afternoon, how would you comment on that? Did I make myself clear? Is it, yeah? You're digesting? Okay. I'll give you 2 minutes. Yeah, Fransje, please.
Well, I wanted to make a remark for you in your former question, but it's actually bridging to this one. So maybe let's give them time to think about it because I don't have the answer. But no, you were saying either physical or, say, socio-economical, but I would say that they're inseparable. Because I think your position on this globe, connected to the landscape, your climate has always been also steering on how the people were acting and if they were prosperous in this. And well, we as Dutch were in a very bad territory, as the Romans said, but we did manage to make it prosper. So there's really an interaction between the physical and how we respond to this. So, and this is also, of course, then is also in how you are, what kind of government that you end up with, and how you organize your economy or your risks, etc. So it is inseparable.
Right. Thanks. So, any thoughts on balancing the disbalance between limited resources and the size of the challenge? Erik-Jan.
Well, again, in our workshop, I found it really striking is resources in terms of money or material we didn't discuss, but more like resources in terms of politics. And the yes, and for instance, the kind of the, I mean, I'm not an expert on the Po Delta, but it struck me that there seems to be kind of like a lack of political resource, to think in the far future about these topics. Well, actually, if you look at 2100, the whole northern Adriatic Sea region, will kind of flood. So there is an urgency, but I don't know if there's a sense of urgency yet on a political level. And in America, there's more like a battle of politics going on, So and that's also an important resource. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe so to add to that.
Yeah.
It was interesting, actually. I think that it's not even, at least in our case, it's not even that much a matter of limited resources, but the fact that who's responsible for what actually, and who's actually giving money on which scale. And sometimes that's
what
even
I'm referring
actually
to, the scale of intervention.
We had a lot of discussion, mainly to just first understand how the situation is organized, because then you can actually understand how you can intervene. And that's also that made for me actually really like huge differences between the cases. So you can make really nice plans, but actually if it doesn't fit actually to the way governance and the way money is organized is being organized actually, then your plan actually cannot land, you could say.
Yeah. Personally, I'm very interested in trying to find very local interventions and modification with a large effect on a larger scale. I think an approach on a deltaic level needs those sorts of strategies, to really find out where the heart of the matter would be, adjusting just a little bit with a very large effect on, let's say, upstream distribution of water, for example. But that's just a sort of a hypothesis. Diego.
It's exactly in the same line. We were with Tana in Delta in Kenya and Paraná in Argentina, both extremely important geopolitical navigability perspective to the hinterland. And there was a clear agreement in a kind of governance determinism that at the geopolitical level and even at a national level, there is accord in the private and public sector in the co-development of basically the new infrastructures, but it's in the local level, precisely where the adaptation to happen, is where basically a total fragmented definitions on the governance and in the capacity, particularly in these countries where the local levels tend to be more poor in capacities, economical and technical capacity, where in both cases they find an enormous problem in controlling, in expanding, and also in the competition, particularly in the invasion, let's say, or the redevelopment, formal and informal, on the local level. So precisely it's in the local level where in these two deltas we find enormous complexities, and in the geopolitical level a lot of agreements. So there is something there to
take into account.
To take into account.
Absolutely. Thank you, Diego. Stefan, an addition.
Yeah, I think in the comparison with the Pearl River Delta and the Mekong Delta, we discussed also the friction between, let's say, long-term perspectives and short-term projects.
Actions, yeah.
And what you see that there are usually big ambitions for the long term, but actually the projects are not aligned with that. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that usually, let's say, the regional vision, long-term perspective is missing. So then you have a lot of beautiful projects in themselves, but actually they compete or even conflict with each other at a lower scale level or even cause problems. So therefore, also this kind of regional coordination turned out to be a very important element. And that's also what we see nowadays in the Dutch policy context. Also this friction between, let's say, localized ambitions and the regional perspective.
Thank you. Piet.
Yeah, again, you inspire me again. One way to overcome this was basically the idea behind the Rebuild by Design competition in New York and the US East Coast. One idea by President Obama, Sean Donovan, and then our own Henk Ovink, who took the lead there. The idea was basically not so much to come up with a system that would be flood resilient or whatever, but to come up with new ideas, inspirational ideas, based on design, but also based on community involvement, a very strong local community involvement, and basically only intended to ignite development.
Right.
And the solutions that Henk wanted to see should be representative, they should be scalable, they should be multiplied, but they didn't need to solve everything on its own. But the idea was and when Henk was asked, like, Henk, what did you do? This is not a complete system. He said, I never wanted a system. I wanted a movement. I wanted to start something where, you know, Henk has big words for those kind of things, but it's very inspirational, this idea of let's simply start somewhere, let's see how it can grow, let's see this as catalysts for development in a delta. And currently, you see, we're 10 years after Sandy, and we see the first projects being completed now, and we see also how the thinking has evolved in developing those ideas. So
Thank you.
it's a very inspirational example, I think.
Henk Oving wasn't able to come to the Congress, but now you brought him into the room anyhow, so that's good. Let's move to the third issue that I want to raise, which is related to the fact that deliberately it was framed as not only research and analysis, but also design and let's say, putting things together. That's also why I personally embarked. I think it's a very strong, let's say, sort of impetus to also the emancipation of my profession, landscape architecture, in the context of deltaic futures. And I couldn't help it. It was just by coincidence, I think. It's a matter of availability. But the three venues that were selected for these 2 days, starting with the Art Hall, the Kunsthal in Rotterdam, now in Faculty of Architecture in the campus, and now the Green Village. Actually, they, I would say, illustrate the triangle of the approach that is necessary. It's about imagination, it's about design and engineering, and it's about rebalancing our position towards nature, which is actually happening in this room as well. Or let's say the structure itself illustrates completely resilient architecture. But again, it also creates, I would say, a debate on the, let's say, the complementarity of those disciplines. So, you know, what do they have in common and what does distinguish them? And actually, the whole notion of multidisciplinarity that is behind this initiative of bringing together those specializations, those expertises. So again, potentiality and limitations of a multidisciplinary approach is my third issue. Do we really have to understand the complete picture? It's also about where analysis leads to paralysis, you know, do we know it all? Didn't we forget something before we are able to come up with a strategy that is completely valid and completely verifiable? So do we really have to understand the complete picture before we are able to suggest sort of an outlook to delta resilience? How many scenarios do we need more to be convinced of the urgency of our situation? Did you discuss this in your workshop? An open-ended, eternal, investigative route, or is it time to act and take all the risks that go with action? Please.
Yeah, we did discuss it, particularly how Meijer had quite strong observations about it, but he is not present. So like what he described was a study where they started off with this very small multidisciplinary team, and he was really like, okay, now we can get something done. And then basically the network expanded because everyone needed to contribute something. Everyone needed to say something, which led to some kind of paralyzation, although the study still had interesting outcomes. But one of the things he mentions in that book that he wrote is the concept of loosely and strongly coupled systems. And I think that's sometimes something we don't really apply when we're analyzing the complexity of our systems, but can really help to push it forward.
It's strong interdependency and
Exactly.
and looser interdependency.
Rather, what we now often tend to do is just listing all the disciplines that need to be involved,
Exactly.
rather than having a critical look at, okay, where are our connections? And then one other point that's more personal observation about these different disciplines is, especially when I look at my discipline, I'm a civil engineer, water management and hydraulic engineering, and we tend to develop complex computer models, which are sometimes very useful, but also difficult in dialogues with other professions, whereas sometimes we tend, I think, to make models more complex than actually needed, just because of the nice thing of having very fancy scientific output. But I do think but it holds maybe also for other disciplines, that sometimes we need to take more effort in translating our results to something that another discipline can work with to get a dialogue there.
Well put. Stefan.
Yeah, I think what's really important here is also the different modes of science. The inductive and deductive reasoning, they tend to take a long time in a way, especially in complex matters, because what to investigate and what not. But that's the beauty of design thinking, that it is more abductive in nature, so it uses the best of both worlds. So by moving between the hypothesis and, let's say, the data you need, you can also direct the search. So you put a dot on the horizon, and then you also know a little bit better on what you need to know. So then you can also inform, let's say, the sciences to help you out in a more directed search. So it is not about stacking all knowledge on top of each other, and in the end we have a solution, because that will be endless. Mm-hmm. But when you have an idea of what a solution could be, a hypothesis, if you like, and then argue what kind of knowledge you need in order to get there, then it becomes a more directed search.
Right.
And then also the idea becomes a platform for collaboration. And that's, I think, very well illustrated, for instance, by the Room for the River project, where they had this kind of toolbox helping also this kind of design processes to test ideas, which were in a way scientifically underpinned.
Yeah.
So then you make, let's say, by having this clear objective, you also can create operative tools to get there.
It's iteration, which is crucial, I think. You have to start doing smaller things and draw conclusions. I think also that's the essence of the whole notion of research by design, taking design as doing an experiment. You can compare it with physics or chemistry, or you just put things together and see what happens. If it explodes, you know something more than you didn't know before. It's the same with design. If you produce a design and be very analytical and very precise in what you put into it and what comes out of it, you're able to draw conclusions that might be helpful for the next step. I think we're in the middle of that, or even in the beginning of that, I would say. And I think that is the promise of the next 5 years. Okay, last issue, as far as I'm concerned, and then I'll give you the floor to Chris, which is also about the complementarity of those disciplines. How do we deal with the fact that design work has never one answer to a question? It always has many different options besides each other. All are more or less valid, all are more or less verifiable. So how does that relate to, let's say, more Cartesian ways of thinking, that 1 and 1 is 2 and never 3? So what is a productive relationship and iteration between design work that has the tendency to diverge and calculations, verification that has to be brought in by technicians and engineers? Does that work? That's basically also maybe getting some feedback from the 5 teams that are actually working on these 5 different compartments of the Dutch Delta. Jan, for example, you're involved in that. How does it work? Are you really in discussion with the engineers that you have on board?
Well, yes, but your question also got me thinking that, and also relating to the dot on the horizon, and to the work that we're now doing ourselves, a little bit like introspective, is that, with designing and planning, there's always basically 2 options. You can do more of what you're already doing. Build more dikes, have more dams. You can do less, you can do the opposite. do less pumping, emit less CO2. But it's so difficult to, step out of that and do something else, go in a different direction. And I think maybe all three are actually needed, but especially that third one, I think is essential for the work we're doing and also for the debate or the discussion with the scientists, the engineers, and the technicians.
Yeah.
But everybody needs to be open for that. So I think that also what the redesigning deltas is all about. That third, doing something different.
Yes. Opening up new perspectives. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess that almost concludes this session.
Hi, it's Gary Momb. I'm representing the Sustainable and Resilient Coastal Cities project, and of which Delft is a partner. And I thought I'd just make a comment towards the end in relation to human beings. We've talked a bit about social issues and relationship with the physical constructs, etc. But I mean, the physical, dealing with the humans, the human aspect, the human occupation of these deltas right from the outset, and their involvement, of course, with fashioning them and reshaping them. And we discussed there are obviously lots of physical developments around sea level change, etc. But really, a lot of it comes down to that human intervention and the human history. And as we found with looking at these sort of coastal cities, if we want to get people to understand how these adaptations need to be taken forward, you need to engage them, and you engage them with their past on their terms. And this is something we should look to do. And if one's looking to redesign deltas, you need to engage with the humans as they stand at the moment, but you need to give them longer term context to relate them to that sense of place. Then you can have arguments that you can use to help make the changes in the future.
In landscape sciences, this notion of landscape biography and a landscape narrative is now, let's say, elaborated scientifically and in different disciplinary levels of skill and application. Is that something that you would feel comfortable with, those notions of involving people through a landscape biography, for example? Would that help?
Well, it's involving people within, let's say, the landscape biography now, but it's also making sure that one creates it and builds it that will engage with the people to let them know what their relationship to their landscape is and how that landscape's been moulded by those people historically. And there's also scientific value in that as well, but very valuable for that tipping point, as Stephen was on about yesterday from X today, if you want to try and engage the people to change habits and ways of thinking.
Thank you. Any other issues that haven't been covered by these four questions I posed? Anything you would like to add as a sort of a final, Stefan?
Yeah, I think the difference between participation and co-creation, because I think is really important when we want to make a change is a co-creative process in which all stakeholders are equal in a way. And then we as designers are one of the stakeholders. And then you get into a process of mutual learning, you can say. You can learn from the local people, you can learn from the government, you can learn from other disciplines, and they can learn from you. And when you have a proper basis on what the landscape is where you are working on, then you can also identify the challenges and potentials connected to that together. Mm-hmm. And then you can start to build solutions. And then, of course, designers also have a role to play in terms of divergence in order to show the options and also be able to talk about these issues in a constructive way. But in the end, the decision on what to do is also part of this process in which everybody agrees on a certain option. And that's usually these processes take a little bit longer, but they're way more effective than having an idea and superimposing it like we often do.
And have done, yes. Piet.
I always go right behind him. Unfortunately, it's the same people speaking. That's one issue that I would love to find back somewhere. Not issued here today, not mentioned, but extremely interesting for the design process and also from a scientific point of view is cultural heritage. we hardly realize it, but these deltas are among the oldest places on Earth where human civilization started. And that might be something where they are comparable also, starting from that perspective of benefiting from the same, let's say, fortunate circumstances, land and water, etc. They are often thousands and thousands of years old. And in that cultural heritage and in studying that history, there could be also elements that could trigger a design process and maybe bring also new types of climate resilient solutions that we haven't thought of yet.
I fully agree. I think the guy behind you is also
yes,
fully agreeing.
I agree totally. Well, I'm an archaeologist, so I would. But so you said what I should say. But I would just add to that heritage that's embedded within the landscape can be used to help understand how the morphological changes within the delta have happened through time, which is information that can be used to understand current future changes and help inform the current population, etc. So it's a very valuable tool that shouldn't be overlooked.
True. Okay.
I'm glad someone else said it, not just me.
Just one sentence. That cultural heritage can also help to develop a kind of identity for one delta, but maybe also for multiple deltas, to something that you have in common that you can share in that sense.
Okay.
And that helps maybe to be better recognized as a delta.
Yeah. One comment on this side, on the other side, please. Hoe heet jij? On that side, Enzo. No, this one. No, here.
Maybe one last remark on the cultural heritage and especially talking about our poldering and being all agree on something. I totally disagree with that. I don't think that you should in any way try to all agree on what solution is there. You also have to be able to agree that you disagree. Because if you have to wait until everybody agrees, nothing is going to happen ever in large, complex situations. So when you agree to disagree, you sometimes have to give in, put a little bit water with the wine in this case, and maybe in another time. Oh.
You're saying a little bit of water, but...
And so we need a lot of wine by now, I think. So I'm giving the floor to you back again.
I just want to. I think it's sufficient for now. I want to close off, but I have to. This came in this afternoon. The NOS, the National News Agency, sent out a news item stating that at least the Dutch part of the climate scientists, they say 2 degrees we're not going to make it. So they've sort of given up on the main Paris Agreement quantity. And the results or the consequences are for us, so to speak. So there's urgency and there's a plea for boldness. Peter Glas mentioned this word specifically yesterday morning. He said we need bold activity, bold decisions and bold programs in order to actually meet the new requirements in deltaic situations. Chris, could you please turn this session into a final statement? Thanks for your attention.
Eric, thank you.
You're
well
welcome.
done. Wow. What an amazing 2 days, frankly. And it's beyond, I would say, my expectation, but I assume it holds also for you, that we had the minister and the Delta commissioner in the morning yesterday. It was very, very unique. And even they are supporting or offering support to continue what we are doing. So that is great. Then we had fantastic international engagement. We had representatives of deltas with us. We had expert Tim Lenton, for instance, and he said, hey, my big face on that screen, I felt so embarrassed. You remember in the kijkdoos, there was that big screen in his face, but he was also very much interested in continue working with us. We had a fantastic audience. I really hope that we call each other Delta buddies, that we are really forming a close network and that we stay together. Now, what I try to do with the support of a few, to capture some points which are important for the next step. And the next step would be that we work in Q3 and Q4 this year on a framework program which is all about designing design-based approach in deltas. You know there are initiatives underway. Annemiek Nijhoff with the big ambition, maybe Groeifonds. The Ministry of EWM is also working on that. There are other initiatives, and we want to support those initiatives. And the point of departure is, of course, the methodology and the approaches. We cannot and should not cover all, but that is what we really want to provide and offer. But there are also opportunities to go for specific calls or specific opportunities, for instance, NWO, and there are more. So we also would like to take the lead in some activities where we feel it's appropriate. And please indicate how you want to engage and what you want to get from us and what you want to deliver. That is an open question, not only to you, but to everybody who is interested. So it's an open call, but I know, Erik, you are a bit skeptical. You see, you can, like Hannes also was saying, you should also be a bit careful, otherwise it will be too complex. But we really want to work as much as possible jointly. Then the international deltas, there's a lot going on in Bangladesh. There is a lot going to start in the coming few years. The Netherlands has allocated 60 million euros to invest in Bangladesh. And I assume that in many other deltas, a lot is going to happen in the coming years. So let's see how we can engage and provide our support. Then what I want to say is there are a few other things which are in the pipeline. That is that IPDC, and that state of the delta reporting, which is coming or will be presented at a certain stage. Now, Kim, you are on top of that. I come back to you later, by the way. But there is an opportunity that we can play a role in as a rapporteur or providing information to that initiative. And there are more initiatives underway. The Delta Commissioner has its 6-yearly evaluation, and they want to have this type of expertise and disciplines much stronger on board. So there's also an opportunity. Now let me try to capture some conclusions. And I try to keep it very brief because we want to have a drink. Yesterday, but also today, we need to plan. That was clearly a conclusion in our workshop about the Dutch context. And you would say, hey, the Netherlands, have a culture of planning. But frankly, when we really dive a bit deeper into that, we have a Delta plan, but we have no real plan on our future, let alone the other deltas. So we need to plan, create a new reality to take decisions about our future. So decision making becomes extremely important, not postponing the decision making. Trust across institutions. I felt that we got that. And Charles Waldheim, he clearly said what I have seen is very unique. The trust, the openness, the discussions you have with the different disciplines, different representatives from the government and the knowledge institution. He was saying in the US it's impossible. So we have something very unique. There is a desire to collaborate. We expressed that very clearly. The civic society is not yet on board, by the way. That was also articulated as a very important missing point. We share, there is a sense of urgency, that's an open door, but there is also momentum to step forward. We need for adaptation also an open door, but that needs to be transformative. Now, that is for you, but that is at least a common ground we discussed and agreed upon. Then what is a new kid on the block, in my view? And that really comes from the design teams. I think as you started with that, but a sort of activistic stance. We really want to make a difference, in particular the designers. That was clearly mentioned, but also Dirk Loorbach was also triggering this. So activistic stance. But on the other hand, we also have to acknowledge that activistic stance is good, but is not sufficient. We need to do more, and I like very much the framing of Dirk. He said we should be radical, also in terms of ideas and aspirations, but we should be diplomatic, and that comes from you, also open for each other, for other opinions on the short term. So this would be, I would say, our stance in this whole process. Yeah? Activistic, but also open and diplomatic. Our joint ambition is, and if you are not agree, tell us, identify, develop appealing futures across full range. So Bas Jongman was clearly saying, don't be selective. Don't put preference on living with water alternatives and leave the other ones out. Take the full range and all alternatives. That's one. Then the pathways to get there, and what is important is, and that is, I think, really, really important, where our position could be clearly there, is the underpinning, the scientific underpinning of the steps to get there. This is, if you agree, our, would say, level playing field. Are the principles we will build upon our program. You get a chance to say something about that, if you want, within a minute. Secondly, we discussed what is design, and there are a lot of definitions, a lot of interpretations. I don't want to go into that, because that is, you will never get out of that discussion if you really want to arrive at a uniform, joint definition or description. But we agree that it is to address complexity, to foster inclusiveness, and to make it political. That is the three terms which came out of the discussions. When we talk about design 2.0, we all feel that there is a need to embark on a sort of design 2.0. We are not yet what that really is, but we feel it is balancing between problem solving and value creation. It's about adaptation, it's an open door, but also mitigation. It has to cover the broad spectrum. Now, from that it follows that transdisciplinarity is so important. Then we discussed the tipping points, and Tim Lenton is the professor on tipping points. Dirk Loorbach came also with some nice ideas. Positive tipping points means that there is a driving force outside the domain which does the system tip. Right? And that driving force outside the domain can be created, can be fostered by creating the enabling environment. And that is, I think, something new, what we could take on board. And it seems a bit vague, but Dirk Loorbach has specific ideas on that. And in the Biennale, we can have that discussion. The change will probably not come from inside, but come from outside. That is what we more or less discussed. Then, last slide. A call to join us. We already are Delta buddies. Nobody objects? We are Delta buddies. We build strong international network and partnership. That is what we want to do. Be open, share as much as possible. Further articulation of our research and design challenge is needed, but I think the yield of the 2 days is enormous, and we will make some cake out of that. We will come back to to this, but it is also a joint process. In Q3 and Q4, we want to work on an ambitious international multi-year program, and within that program, we want to position different initiatives and projects and so on. And everybody who wants to step forward and take the lead is being challenged. That is what I want to say. It is an invitation.